The first thing that held my eyes wasn't the burned mattress or the twisted springs. It was a school ID, edges, blistered corners, warped a child's smile still stubborn under the soot. Someone had sealed it in darkness for 4 decades, but the face refused to dim. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Most mornings, before the city rubs the sleep out of its eyes, I drive past the Passaic and watch steam lift off the water like breath in cold air. Newark at that hour feels honest trucks idling at lights, a diner putting out trays of eggs and ham, a bus bending long around the curb. My office sits 3 blocks from a row of brick warehouses that hold more ghosts than tools now. I keep a window cracked even in October. The air has a clean bite around 48 degrees C, and I like the sound of the flag rope ticking against the pole outside the precinct, a small rhythm that reminds me the day is still ordinary until it isn't. Cold Case lives at the top of the old municipal annex where the elevator lurches at the 5th floor. The carpet is thin as a postcard. The radiators hiss when they feel like cooperating. On my desk, you'll find 2 black pens, an ash-gray mug with a crack running down the handle, and a lined notebook with years of neat handwriting. I start every day the same way 1 page of names places dates, 1 page of what-ifs. Routine isn't romance for me, it's a rope. You hold it when you walk into dark rooms. Sarge Ali has a way of showing up exactly when the coffee hits that first good sip. He calls me Cal, sets his thermos on the corner of my caseboard, and studies old photos like they might blink if he stares them down long enough. He's got the kind of laugh that fills an empty hallway. He doesn't use it much at work. On slow days, we catalog. We log old evidence. We call people who prefer not to remember. On most days, the open files sit there with their quiet weight and dare you to be patient. Out beyond Broad Street, the wind carries a hint of starch and motor oil when it blows the right way, a phantom reminder of the years when factories punched the time clock for the whole county. Newark used to hum. The Emblem textile plant once anchored a neighborhood where men came home with lint in their eyebrows and women shook out aprons in tiny backyards. Paychecks bought porch furniture and church dresses and kitchens with linoleum floors that you could wipe clean in a minute flat. When Emblem was still alive, you could stand on its loading dock and hear the city in layers looms rattling like rain radios, chattering ball games, a forklift beeping as it backed up a few feet at a time. The place had a heartbeat you could measure in yards of cloth and money by the week. In the summer of 1982, the heat sat heavy over the county. Old box fans pushed hot breath across slick tile, and men worked with shirts clinging to their shoulders. The factory's east windows opened only a few inches. The glass caught the noon glare and floated dust like snow. Lou Rain's thick wrists shaved head keys that chimed when he moved, walked those aisles like he was coaxing an old engine to keep going one more season. People said he was the guy who could trade a curse with a broken belt and get it humming again before the shift bell. He wore the kind of work boots that leave permanent prints in concrete dust. On weekday mornings, a boy waited on a second-floor catwalk because he liked the view, 9 years old with a bowl cut and ears a little too big for his face. He'd lean his elbows on the rail and look down on the machines like he was standing at the edge of a city. He carried a metal lunchbox that clicked when he opened it, and he kept a couple of cherry hard candies in the small inside pocket that used to hold chalk. Workers passed him with nods and careful smiles. Someone pressed a butterscotch into his palm one day, and he tucked it away like treasure. The foreman grumbled about liability, and then forgot to finish the sentence. Lou had a way with the kid. "Stay where I can see you," he'd say, tapping 2 fingers to his own chest, and then pointing to the spot on the catwalk where sunlight made a square on the paint. The boy would nod and hold up his lunch like proof he'd be good. That's how people guarded what they loved back then, with rules and sightlines. Not cameras, not lanyards and barcodes. The plant measured safety by who was watching and how far a voice could carry over the looms. That was a time when a grown man's word and a heavy door latch felt like enough. Clyde Braxley worked the furnace wing, a narrow run of corridor with a smell all its own hot metal solvent. Something faintly sweet that stuck in your nose even after you went outside. He kept an apron hung on a nail and a wrench set rolled tight like a flag. People said he was punctual and quiet, that he could read a gauge the way a farmer reads clouds. On a good day, he nodded to the boy up on the catwalk. On a bad day, he didn't look up at all. He clocked in and out with a flat expression, a man who kept his sentences short and his pockets full of folded paper towels from the washroom sink. If you were standing at the loading dock that July, you'd have seen the same things every morning. A delivery truck nudge in from the street. A driver ease it back with that steady beep that never bothered anybody. Two guys slide a metal ramp into place and a clerk tuck a clipboard under his arm like it was part of him. Newark in the heat smells like hot brick and fried onions at lunchtime. That summer, it also smelled like bleach and dye when the barrels rolled. The men wiped their hands on rags and talked about the Yankees and gas prices and which bridge would be a mess at 5. Up the street, girls jump-roped in sneakers that left chalk prints on the sidewalk. Mothers listened for their names out a window just cracked enough to catch a breeze. Ethan, he liked to draw rockets on scrap paper and tape them to the wall near the time clock. He pressed them down hard so the corners wouldn't curl. He knew the names of half the machines and 2/3 of the men who ran them. He could count 49 steps from the staircase landing to the spot on the catwalk where the sunlight square receded by noon, and he checked it every day as if the square kept time better than the plant whistle. He collected the little plastic tag ends that snipped off the bolts of cotton because he liked how they looked in a row. When he walked, his sneakers squeaked just enough to make people grin. Lou kept his apartment close 9 blocks west, walkable in 20 minutes if you didn't mind the heat. His sister worked doubles at the hospital and dropped Ethan off early sometimes with a note tucked under the lunchbox lid. Back by 5, remember his glasses. The apartment had a window unit that coughed cool air 2 feet out and then gave up, and a table with ring marks from sweating soda cans. On good nights, the boy fell asleep with the TV murmuring baseball and the window screen rattling soft when the wind shifted. On mornings, Lou drove them in a car that smelled of old tobacco, even though he'd quit, and he picked up a coffee that burned his tongue and made his first joke by the light at the corner of 18th Avenue always the same joke, because repetition is its own kind of lullaby. You'd think a plant that big would be loud with conversation, but people learn to talk with eyebrows and chin tilts when machines chew the air. The small comforts matter: a foreman who always nods first, the porter who keeps the floor dry by the ice machine, the click of a pen on a clipboard when numbers behave. Newark has a way of teaching you the value of small order. Freeways are a mile away. Sirens roll along the edges, but in here the board says which loom runs which color, and the man with the keys keeps the hallway doors honest. The plant's rules were posted above the time clock in thick black letters. Number 3 was simple. Report malfunctions immediately. The sign had grease fingerprints along the bottom from men who steadied themselves while reading it. Hands remember what eyes forget. On Saturdays, Lou sometimes let Ethan help carry a small tool tray because it made the boy feel like an apprentice. He kept a hand on the tray's edge to take the weight. "Grip with your whole hand," he'd say. "Don't pinch it." The boy nodded and kept his chin up, proud and careful. A little soldier walking beside a man who knew where all the switches lived. The furnace wing door wore a sagging sign that said, "Employees only," in faded paint. The hinges moaned if you didn't lift on the handle. Lou lifted. He always lifted. Habit protects more than rules do. The summer got hotter. Thermometers hung beside the west windows hit 92 degrees in the shade by noon. Men loosened collars. The soda machine ran out of grape 2 days in a row. Someone put a box fan on the second-floor landing, and it did nothing but move warm air from one person's face to the next. A maintenance log sat on a clipboard by the boiler with the usual chicken scratch temps, PSI initials a dot for when a reading looked odd. Nobody liked the new solvent. It bit at the throat. But the foreman said it evaporated clean and saved a few dollars a drum, and the plant had been trying to save a few dollars a drum since Jimmy Carter left office. I wasn't there in '82, but files talk if you listen the right way. You can smell the dye when you unfold the old inspection slips. You can hear the loading dock buzzer if you stare at the hand-drawn floor plan long enough. It was a place held together by men who could coax tired machines to make one more run, and by women who learned to press a crease sharp even when the iron spit. People made their lives in those routines. Safety came from the countable things, the notched keys on a ring, the 2-mile drive home, the porch light you switched on at dusk without thinking. 40-some years later, when my days are still ordinary, I sit at my desk and imagine one of those ordinary mornings, the way you look at a photograph and fill in the edges. 9 blocks from the plant, a mother tightens her hair with one hand and checks the clock with the other. In the hallway, a boy ties his sneakers twice because the first bow didn't feel right. Lou pats down his pockets, wallet, keys, handkerchief, a stub pencil, and that little click when the key ring finds the rest. The heat already has a hold of the stairwell. They walk out into it anyway. At the plant, the door latch shows the same old scrape it's had since someone jammed it with a dolly back in '79. Sunlight lands on the catwalk in a perfect square. The fan on the second-floor landing rattles. A forklift complains. The air over the boiler shivers with heat, and the solvent smell sits low near the floor. Somewhere on the other side of the building, a radio tries to catch the news and loses it in static. I returned to my notebook the morning this story truly began and wrote the same 4 words I'd written 1,000 times. What am I missing? It was just another entry. Black ink on lined paper. Nothing in the handwriting to suggest what was about to tilt the day. Down on the river, geese cut a V and left ripples that reached the bulkhead in long, patient rows. Up on the 6th floor, the rope on the flagpole tapped the rhythm it always taps. My coffee cooled in the cracked mug. At Emblem, a clerk slapped the daily sheet onto a clipboard and let it thump. A driver eased a truck into place, straightened the wheel a hair, then a hair more, and set the brake. The factory took a breath like it always did at mid-morning, that steady half-minute when nothing moves, and then everything does. In the apartment, 9 blocks west, someone left the porch light off because there'd be daylight for hours. In the hallway, a lunchbox clicked shut. On the plant floor, the loading dock buzzer chirped one stuttered note and cut off. I looked at my phone around 10 and noticed nothing at all. No call, no text. Just the ordinary hum of a day that still believed in itself. And out there in a building that had taught a neighborhood how to count on routines, a metal door settled back against its frame and kept its secrets for a little too long. By mid-morning, the heat had started to rise off the river again, and the city felt like it was breathing through a wet towel. I was back at my desk when my phone lit up a number from the demolition division. The man's voice on the other end was flat but uneasy, like he was trying not to believe what he'd just seen. Detective Mercer. We've got something at the old Emblem textile site. Smells bad. Real bad. I asked what kind of bad, but he only said, "You'll want to come down here yourself." I could hear the machines humming behind him, the high metallic whine of saws against concrete. 40 years is a long time for silence, and when something finally breaks it, you feel it in your stomach before your mind catches up. By the time I reached the site, the morning haze had thickened over the lot. The plant was stripped to its bones, window frames hanging like ribs weeds, pushing through cracks that once held tile. A few of the demo crew stood off to the side, masks loose around their chins, staring toward the west boiler wall. The air carried that sharp chemical note of old asbestos and something else under it, sweet, rancid, alive. Henry Dorsey, the site supervisor, met me halfway across the floor. He had gray dust in his beard and eyes that looked older than they probably were. "We were cutting under the boiler for drainage," he said, "and one of the guys hit a hollow patch." He pointed toward a low section of wall near the far corner. "Sounded wrong." Then we smelled it. They'd already shut down the machinery. The silence inside that building was heavier than any noise could have been. I walked across the debris boots, crunching glass and plaster. The air was so thick it seemed to stick to my gloves. When I reached the far wall, I saw it a furnace door, maybe 4 feet across, welded shut with a sloppy line that had bubbled and cooled unevenly. A cut had already been started along the edge, and the metal showed fresh orange scars where the torch had bitten in. Someone had sprayed a number on the wall, 17, probably a marking for removal. "This wasn't on any city plans," Henry said quietly. "That furnace doesn't connect to any of the main lines." Forensics was already on the way, but the smell was getting worse. I knelt, touched the edge with the back of my glove, warm not from heat, but from whatever gases had built up behind it. I told the crew to step back, vent the space, and wait for clearance. When the metal finally gave way, it screeched like it hadn't moved in a lifetime. The first rush of air that came out was stale and thick, and even with a respirator on it, hit like rot and chemicals tangled together. Flashlights flicked on. The beam cut through the dark chamber and found what looked like a pile of melted debris. There was a mattress, spring-collapsed inward blackened fabric still clinging to it in places, and something shiny in the corner. One of the techs crouched, lifted it with tweezers, and held it up to the light, a piece of plastic warped but clear enough to make out part of a school district seal. When I leaned in, the name came into focus beneath the burn marks. Ethan Rains, Grade 4, Room 3. The photo was half gone, but the face was still there. A boy's face, round cheeks, straight brown hair. The kind of picture you see taped to the side of a refrigerator, smiling against a blue paper background. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the hum of the generator outside and the slow creak of the furnace door shifting against its hinges. I could feel the hair rise on my arms under the suit. After all the years of dead paper there, he was a name we'd all stopped saying. Back at the station, the old cold case files came up faster than I expected. 1982. 9-year-old boy missing from the emblem plant where his uncle worked maintenance. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, just a dock door left open and an empty lunchbox found near the stairs. The original report said possible runaway. That word was still hard to swallow. Children don't run away from factories at 10 in the morning. They disappear because someone takes them. The case had been closed out 2 years later for lack of evidence, moved to archive storage, and forgotten until the day Henry Dorsey's saw hit metal. By the time the forensic team finished their initial sweep, the chamber had turned into a narrow window into 1982. There were traces of accelerant soaked into the concrete bits of melted plastic, maybe toys and what looked like fragments of synthetic foam from a mattress. The evidence techs bagged everything, labeling each piece like glass. Under one corner of the panel, they found something else, a rusted clipboard wrapped in old plastic sheeting. Inside, a maintenance log with line after line of temperature readings, all written in the same steady hand, until one entry broke pattern. July 18th, 1982. Door resealed. No access without key. Lou said not to log anything further. The ink had bled, but the name Lou was clear enough. Lou Rains, the boy's uncle, the man in charge of that floor. I sat in my car that night with the file open across the steering wheel. Rain tapped against the windshield. The headlines from the time were clipped and clinical boy vanishes from Newark factory. The details were worse, how the plant had been struggling financially, how the workers were told not to speak to reporters, how Lou had moved out of state within a few years and never gave another interview. Every mention of him in the record stopped cold after 1988. The silence felt deliberate. When you reopen an old case, you learn that memory is the most fragile kind of evidence. People don't just forget, they rearrange. They tuck away what doesn't fit. I started with blueprints, city records inspection permits. That plant had been modified dozens of times over the years, but one section always stayed blank, the furnace wing. Every renovation plan marked it restricted access. No notation, no square footage, no reason. The next morning, I called for the originals. When they came through yellowed and brittle from microfilm, I laid them flat under the lamp. The ink lines showed 2 levels beneath the main floor. The first was standard maintenance access, 6 feet of clearance for wiring and steam lines. The second, unlisted in later plans, showed a chamber directly under the furnace unit connected by a crawl space. It had no vent, no drain, and no exit other than the sealed door. Whoever built it meant for it to stay closed. We brought in ground-penetrating radar that afternoon. The results came back just before dusk, a hollow pocket under the slab roughly the size of a small bedroom. No structural connection to the rest of the plant. As the torch crews cut through the remaining welds, I stood back with Ali watching the sparks fall like short-lived fireflies. When the final bolt gave a piece of steel dropped inward and hit with a soft, muffled sound, not the ring of empty metal. The first whiff of air that rose out carried the unmistakable note of long-sealed decay. I climbed down the ladder myself. The light from above barely reached the floor. My flashlight caught the curve of a rusted bedframe in one corner, a child's bedsheet crumpled to colorless rags, and a scattering of small objects. A cup, a broken action figure, a handful of candy wrappers still bright under the dust. There were marks on the wall, little scratches in the concrete about the height of a child's hand. The silence down there wasn't like silence anywhere else. It had weight. When I turned my light toward the far side, I saw 2 chains bolted into the floor beside a small wooden chair. That was when I stopped breathing. Back upstairs, I didn't say much. There isn't a word that covers what you feel when a place gives up something it's been hiding for 40 years. It isn't horror, exactly. It's older than that, a kind of grief that doesn't know its own age. The forensics team took over marking every inch. When they asked if I wanted to leave before they finished, I told them no. Some scenes you owe your presence to, however late it comes. At headquarters, the discovery shifted everything. What had been a cold file was now a live investigation with evidence of unlawful confinement, homicide, and deliberate concealment. My captain briefed the district attorney before sunset. The order came back the same hour: locate all surviving employees from 1982. Anyone with keys to that floor. Anyone who touched that furnace wing. That meant starting with 2 names: Lou Raines and Clyde Braxley. The personnel logs were a mess, but cross-referencing payroll and union records gave me what I needed. Clyde had been a boiler technician hired in '81, quietly dismissed 3 weeks after Ethan vanished. His termination form listed contract concluded, no forwarding address. Lou had signed the paperwork himself. That night after the lab shut down, I sat alone in the cold case office with the evidence board half-built photos from the site blueprints pinned in layers, the old yearbook photo of Ethan in the center. The boy's grin was off-center, 1 tooth missing. Around him, I wrote what we had so far sealed chamber accelerant use maintenance log, 2 keys. The fluorescent light flickered once overhead and then steadied. Sometimes, when you work long enough, the job stops being about justice and starts being about bearing witness, about making sure someone finally writes the truth in ink that doesn't fade. When I locked up that night, the city was already asleep. A breeze carried the smell of rain and something faintly metallic from the demolition yard. I paused at the edge of the lot and looked back at the skeletal outline of the emblem plant. Even gutted, it looked proud, as if it still believed it was making something useful. The generator lights painted the broken windows yellow, and for a moment I thought I saw movement inside, just a trick of shadow, maybe a draft lifting a piece of tarp. But it looked almost like a small hand pressed against the glass before the light shifted and the shape was gone. I stood there until the crew lights clicked off one by one, leaving only the red beacon of a single crane blinking against the dark. Somewhere deep under that building, a boy's name had waited for 42 years to be spoken again. I didn't know it yet, but what we'd uncovered wasn't the end of that silence. It was the first crack in a wall that went much deeper than any of us imagined. The night after we opened the bunker, I didn't sleep much. It wasn't nightmares, not exactly just the echo of that air rising up from the floor, that smell that doesn't belong anywhere near human memory. It stuck in my nose like smoke after a fire, the kind that clings no matter how many times you wash your hands. When I came into the office that morning, the lab lights were still on, and the evidence trays from the furnace were laid out in rows across the counter. Danilawo, our lead tech, had been there all night. She didn't look up when I walked in. "You should see this yourself," she said quietly. I followed her to the main table, where they'd separated the melted debris. There were traces of cloth and wiring bits of blackened metal fragments of something pale that no one wanted to name too early. Then she lifted one small piece with tweezers and held it under the lamp. The shape was unmistakable, a warped frame, the kind you'd find on a child's eyeglasses. "Prescription lenses," she said, "issued through the school voucher program." I knew right then whose they were. Ethan wore glasses. I didn't have to check the file to remember that. Dana sealed the fragment in a fresh bag while the hum of the vent filled the silence between us. There are moments in this job when the evidence isn't just proof, it's a voice. It says what the dead can't. That morning I heard a child telling me plain as day I was here. By the end of the week, we had 2 living names and nowhere to put them. Lou Raines, the uncle who sealed that room, and Clyde Braxley, the man who disappeared right after the boy did. I kept both names pinned above Ethan's photo on the board. The lines between them were thin pieces of red string, but in my head the connections were heavier than that. Lou had access keys authority. Clyde had the skill to build and maintain the furnace. Together, they were the gatekeepers of the one part of the factory nobody else ever entered. We traced Lou first. DMV hit in West Virginia, small town called Finch Hollow. Population barely 600, tucked against a ridge where mailboxes leaned into the wind, and nobody locked their doors. I drove out with a local officer named Harlan. The road narrowed the farther we went, the kind of 2-lane blacktop that seems to end in trees. When we reached the address, the house looked forgotten, paint gone dull, a porch sagging under its own weight, an old Ford truck sitting flat on its tires. I knocked once. A dog barked somewhere inside, then quiet. When the door opened, Lou stood there in a threadbare flannel coffee mug in hand. His face was older than I expected, skin drawn tight around the jaw eyes like worn glass. The mug said number 1, Uncle. I introduced myself, told him why I was there. The moment I said Ethan's name, he froze. Didn't even blink. After all this time, he said softly, "Why now I told him the truth." We found a sealed furnace room, and we found Ethan's ID inside. His hand trembled, the mug clinking against the doorframe. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and told me to come in. The air in that house was thick, stale, with cigarette smoke and something metallic like old plumbing. The kitchen clock on the wall had stopped years ago at 3:12. Lou sat at the table, his hands clasped around the mug like he needed its warmth. "I thought I could forget," he said. 40 years. I tried to make myself believe he ran off. But you can't really forget something you welded shut. I let him talk. You don't rush men like Lou, they only speak when the guilt burns hot enough. I was on the early shift. He went on. Ethan was supposed to stay in the break room, drink his soda. I turned my back for 20 minutes. When I couldn't find him, I checked everywhere, even the roof. His voice thinned out. Then I saw Clyde. He said Clyde had been hanging around the furnace wing more than usual that week, taking extra hours no one had assigned him. Claimed he was calibrating. Lou told me he'd warned him before, said the man had a way of talking to kids that didn't sit right. He called Ethan his helper. Lou said, shaking his head. Told me the boy liked the machines. But I saw the way he watched him and I should have done something. I asked what he did after the boy vanished. His eyes went glassy. 2 days later, I found that room. I had the master key. The lock was warm. I opened it and I saw the mattress, his jacket, food wrappers, and that smell. I thought Clyde took him somewhere else, that maybe he was still alive. He pressed his thumb hard into the mug handle. I panicked. I burned it, welded it shut. I thought if I erased it, I could make it not real. I let the silence hang. He kept talking, the words tumbling out like they'd been waiting decades for air. "I didn't know he was still in there," he said. "I swear to God I didn't." He looked up at me, then eyes red and wet, and for a moment I saw a man crushed under the weight of his own cowardice. I asked him where Clyde went. "He left that night," Lou said. "Didn't clock out, didn't pick up his pay, left his tools behind." When I left the house, the sky was low and gray. Harlan looked at me over the hood of the cruiser. "He confess?" he asked. I shook my head. He remembered I said, "And sometimes that's worse." Back in Newark, I had the team pull every surviving record from Emblem's archives. Most of it had been lost to water damage, but the payroll files still told a story. Clyde's name appeared for the last time on July 23, 1982, 2 days after Ethan vanished. A note stapled to his file said, "After incident in furnace wing, placed on unpaid leave." Signed by Lou. 3 weeks later, the company marked him as terminated with no rehire recommendation. No police report, no HR complaint, nothing. Just silence. That night I spread the evidence across the table, Lou's statement. Clyde's file, the logbook, the eyeglasses. One line from that log kept circling my mind. Lou said not to log anything further. It wasn't an instruction to cover an accident. It was an order to stop documenting a crime. The next morning I called the forensics lab. Dana said they'd finished processing the lower level. Beneath the first bunker they'd found a second sealed wall, and behind that another door. Burn marks on the frame, but no full ignition, as if someone had started to torch it and then stopped. The door itself was wooden old, and someone had scratched a name into it through the soot, Ethan. I stood there in that half-lit chamber with the flashlight trembling just slightly in my hand. The letters were carved unevenly, like by someone small pressing hard against the wood. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with cold. I thought about that boy's last hours, about a place meant for heat and machines turned into a prison. The realization came slow, but certain. The fire had never been about destroying him. It had been about erasing what they'd built around him. After the discovery, we called in anyone still alive who'd worked that floor. Most were in their 70s or 80s now. One man, John Resnick, remembered hearing something back then, a child crying quietly in the pipes one night. He told me Lou had brushed it off, said it was just the steam line settling. "We didn't question him," Resnick said. "He was maintenance. He knew the building better than anyone." By then, the evidence had started to take shape into something heavier than one man's mistake. We ran radar deeper into the concrete, mapping the sublevels, and that's when we saw it, a pattern of voids under the main furnace floor, too symmetrical to be natural. Not ducts, not runoff tunnels. Rooms, plural, 8 of them in a line. My heart sank as the realization hit what we'd found wasn't just a hiding place. It was infrastructure. The next phase of the dig began under full federal supervision. They brought in heavy extraction gear and a second forensic team. As the drills broke through the lower slab, the air that escaped was colder, fouler. When I climbed down the new ladder, the beam of my light caught the outlines of cell-like chambers, walls of poured concrete iron bars bolted to the front, rusted padlocks hanging from chains. Each room was small, maybe 4 feet by 6, barely large enough for a cot. Inside the first one lay a decayed mattress, bones arranged where a body would have been. The next cell held a rusted lunchbox sealed with age. Inside were crayon drawings, stick figures labeled with children's names. One of them said Ethan. Another said Liam. I don't remember how long I stood there staring at those drawings. The air was so still it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Someone called up to me from the floor above, but their voice barely reached. In that silence, I thought about every missing child report that had been filed and forgotten in those years. Every mother told it was probably a runaway. Every father who'd checked the locks twice after that. The truth wasn't a single monster in the dark. It was a system a place built to swallow and forget. When we surfaced again, night had already fallen over the site. The crime scene lights threw long white beams across the rubble, and in the distance, sirens rolled through the streets. Ali stood beside the truck, watching the technicians bag the last of the evidence. "You ever think the past just waits?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. We both knew it does. It waits for someone to stop listening to the noise long enough to hear what's still moving under the floor. The next day, the results came back from the DNA samples recovered in the chamber. The small bones matched Ethan Raines. The rest, at least 7 other sets, were still being processed. I sat in the lab while the report printed, the machine humming low and steady. The pages came out one by one, each line, another wound opened. I called Lou that night, told him we'd confirmed Ethan's remains. There was a pause on the line so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he whispered, "He was still there, wasn't he?" I said yes. He made a sound, not a cry exactly, more like air being let out of something hollow. "I welded his grave," he said. I didn't correct him. When I hung up, I stood by my office window for a long time watching the city lights blur in the rain. The emblem plant had finally spoken, but its voice carried more than one story. There were others down there, names we didn't yet know, children no one had claimed. What I felt wasn't closure. It was the beginning of something far larger, the kind of truth that doesn't stay buried once you've seen how it was built. And as the rain kept falling against the glass, I knew we were about to open doors we could never close again. The days that followed blurred together in a way that only happens when a case stops being about a crime and starts feeling like a reckoning. The forensics tents still glowed through the night over what used to be the furnace wing, white light bouncing off concrete dust, the hum of generators filling the quiet between shifts. Inside the cordon, the crews kept working, scraping, photographing, cataloging each new find, another crack in the story we thought we understood. I spent most of that week in the command trailer staring at walls covered in names and dates that refused to line up. The deeper we dug, the more it looked like Emblem Textile hadn't just been a factory, it had been a structure built for something that had nothing to do with cloth or dye. On the 3rd morning, I got the call from the lab confirming the worst, the bones recovered from the lower chamber belonged to Ethan Raines. Hearing it out loud didn't land like shock. It landed like gravity, a truth that had been hanging just above me, waiting to fall. I sat there with the report in my hand and thought about that boy's school picture. How his smile tilted just slightly to one side, how proud he'd probably been to show his mom. That small ordinary moment had lived longer than he did. Lou Raines was still in West Virginia. We had a warrant ready, and the local sheriff drove out with us that afternoon. The ride was quiet. The hills rolled by like they'd seen too many winters to care about what men confessed inside them. When we pulled into the driveway, Lou was already sitting on the porch, a folded flannel draped over his lap like he'd been waiting for someone to come finish the story. He didn't resist when I read him his rights. Didn't even ask why. He just nodded and said, "You found him, didn't you?" Inside, the house smelled like dust and cold coffee. We sat across from each other at his kitchen table, the same table where I'd first heard him try to shape his guilt into sentences. This time he didn't dodge. "You know about the other man," he said. I nodded. "Clyde." His mouth worked around the name like it hurt to say. He was trouble from the start. Thought the machines were talking to him. Said the heat in that room made him see things. I tried to keep him away from Ethan, but the boy, he liked learning how things worked, and Clyde liked having someone listen. He paused, staring at the tabletop. I didn't know it had gone that far until it was too late. I asked him what happened that day. He rubbed a hand over his face and took a long breath. I went downstairs to check the gauges. Furnace pressure was high, almost redline. Clyde said he'd handled it, but I didn't see him anywhere. When I came back up, Ethan was gone. I called for him, searched the floor, even checked the roof vent. Then I saw the padlock on the sub-level door hanging open. His voice cracked on the next line. I went in. It was dark, smelled like paint thinner. I heard something move, but I couldn't see past the glare from the furnace. Then Clyde came out from the corner, said everything was fine. Told me the kid had left with one of the drivers. But I knew he was lying. His eyes were wrong glassy, like he hadn't blinked in hours. He said he went back 2 days later with his master key. Found the lock, relatched heat still radiating from the floor. Inside the room was scorched. The mattress blackened, the air heavy with rot. He didn't find a body, only the smell. I couldn't think. He whispered. I just kept seeing my sister's face, hearing what she'd say if she knew I brought him there. So I did what cowards do. I welded it shut. I thought I was sealing up my mistake. Turns out I was sealing up my own blood. When the confession recording stopped, the room stayed quiet. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate between ticks. I looked at him. This man who'd carried a secret so corrosive it had hollowed him out from the inside. You could have stopped him, I said. He nodded slowly. I could have done a lot of things. We drove him back in silence. He didn't look out the window, and I didn't ask where his mind went. Back in Newark, we were already uncovering another layer of the factory's history. Clyde Braxley had vanished in '82, but his name hadn't. Old Union ledgers showed his signature on equipment orders through 1985, 3 years after the company claimed he'd been terminated. And now we had proof that the furnace complex was expanded around that same period. It wasn't random. Someone with power had authorized it. Then, as if the case wanted to twist the knife one last time, we got a call from Pennsylvania State Police. A property registered to a Clyde R. Braxley had been located a rundown cabin miles from the nearest town. The local sheriff found the door locked from the inside, dust so thick it muted the sound of his boots. In the floorboards, under a loose plank, they found a metal box. Inside were 6 VHS tapes, a child's denim jacket, and a folded letter. The tapes were sealed and sent to our evidence lab, but the letter was read to me over the phone that night. The handwriting was shaky, ink faded, but the words were steady enough to feel like confession. Lou burned him, but I killed him first. I didn't mean to. He wouldn't stop crying. I made it quiet. Then I couldn't face it. I left him there. I thought the fire would clean it. It didn't. Don't forgive me. I remember sitting in my car after that call, staring at my reflection in the windshield. The streetlight above me flickered, and for a second, I saw my own face the way I see crime scenes, detached, blurred, more ghost than person. The tapes arrived the next morning. They were labeled in thick black marker Princess Room Volume 1 through 6. We digitized them carefully frame by frame, using a filtered monitor to avoid direct exposure in case the contents were what we feared. The first showed nothing but the corner of a concrete room, a pink vanity set a bed, and a static camera mounted on a tripod. In the third, the sound came through, faintly a small voice. A boy's, maybe Ethan's. He said he wanted to go home. Then a man's voice answered from off-screen, low and calm. Smile for the princess. That was all I could take. I told the tech to stop the playback. By noon, the DA's office had seen enough to file multiple counts murder, unlawful confinement, production of child exploitation material, obstruction of justice. Lou was charged as an accessory, Clyde posthumously confirmed as primary offender. But the relief that should have come with that kind of closure never did. Not when you realize the crime didn't die with them. The factory hadn't been just their hiding place. It had been a network's shell. As more tapes were reviewed, we began finding new names scrawled on masking tape labels, not just Ethan's but others. Some with initials, others with words like compliant or closed. The implications were almost too large to hold in one mind. Still, we kept watching, cataloging, tracing fingerprints. Every discovery made the air in that lab feel heavier. One night after the rest of the team went home, I stayed behind with Dana to review the final bin. The sound of the tape rewinding filled the room, that dry plastic whirring that always reminded me of childhood home movies. But there was nothing innocent in what we found. The final minutes showed a small concrete corridor lined with doors. 8 of them, just like what we'd uncovered. Each door marked with a number and a date. One frame caught the reflection of a man adjusting the camera, his ID badge glinting under the light. The logo read EML Textile Maintenance. Dana paused the playback and turned to me. "That's their uniform," she said. I nodded. "Yeah, and that's not Clyde. We didn't sleep that night." By morning, the pieces had shifted again. Lou wasn't just a coward who buried a crime, he'd been part of the machinery. Maybe not from the beginning, but close enough. In the later tapes, we heard another voice behind the camera. Older, softer, almost paternal. At one point, the voice called the boy Sparkplug, Lou's nickname for Ethan. When I confronted him in holding, he didn't deny it. He said Clyde had forced him, threatened to frame him, that he'd been too deep to stop. I asked him how deep that was. He didn't answer. When they let him out in cuffs, the building felt colder somehow, like the air had turned inward. Justice doesn't look like it does on paper. Sometimes it's just a man walking down a hallway while the rest of us stand still, knowing we're only seeing the surface of something that went far below ground. That evening, I walked the edge of the demolition site one last time. The crews had paused work, floodlights casting long shadows over the cracked concrete. The emblem sign, rusted and half-fallen, still clung to the main arch. Beyond it, the wind moved through broken windows, making a sound that could almost have been breathing. I thought about Ethan's last words on the recovered tape, his small voice saying, "If someone sees this, I didn't run away." He was right. He hadn't. He'd been taken, used, buried, and forgotten until the ground itself decided to remember. As I left, the foreman called after me saying the team had found another hatch deeper under the southern foundation, not part of any known blueprint. I told him to secure it and wait for morning. But even before I turned back toward my car, I knew this wasn't the end. Whatever lived beneath that building wasn't finished telling its story. The wind picked up, carrying the faint rattle of a loose chain somewhere in the dark, and I could have sworn it sounded like a child's voice whispering through the dust. The morning we opened that final hatch, the air was colder than it should have been for spring. The light from the flood lamps cut through a haze of dust, hanging there like smoke that didn't want to rise. I stood near the edge of the pit, watching the crew work in slow, careful motions, the hum of the generators blending with the low groan of metal. When the slab finally lifted, the smell that came out was old, not death anymore, but time itself, trapped and stale. I'd smelled it before, in old basements, in sealed rooms, in places where people had tried too hard to forget. It wasn't evil exactly, just the weight of everything we'd buried. The chamber below wasn't large, maybe 8 by 10 walls lined with soundproof padding and a single rusted folding chair in the corner. On the floor sat another camera, still on its tripod, its lens staring up toward the hatch like it had been waiting for an audience. The storage bins stacked along the back wall held what we already feared: more tapes, more evidence of what those men had done, and maybe of who had helped them. By the end of the day, we counted close to 100 labels, each marked with a date, a name, or sometimes just a number. Some went back to the early 70s. It meant what happened to Ethan wasn't an isolated horror. It was the tail end of something that had lived in those walls for years before him. I didn't talk much that day. None of us did. There's a point in an investigation when language just feels too small, when every word you use starts sounding like a way to distance yourself from what's right in front of you. I'd been on homicide scenes, I'd worked missing persons, but nothing prepares you for realizing that building a place meant for ordinary work could have been used for something so deliberate. Every nail, every pipe, every seam in the concrete had been laid by someone who either knew or didn't want to know. When we finally called it for the night, I sat in my car by the river and watched the cranes standing dark against the sky. Across the water, the city lights rippled, reflecting off the current like small, restless fires. It struck me then that for more than 4 decades, all those lights had burned just a few miles from where children were kept in the dark, and no one had seen a thing. Maybe that's the hardest truth about evil. It doesn't always hide far away. Sometimes it just waits behind the hum of ordinary life, counting on people not to look too closely. Over the next few months, the emblem site became something between a crime scene and a graveyard. The federal teams brought in archaeologists to document everything, because what we had wasn't just evidence anymore, it was history, a kind nobody wants to claim. For every confirmed victim, there was another name that never matched to a report, another child whose file had vanished from the system. The lab in Quantico handled the remains with reverence I'll never forget. Little bags carefully labeled passed from one gloved hand to another like relics. We identified 9 children in total. Ethan was one of them, and the oldest dates we found traced back to 1973. None of the families had ever gotten answers. Most had stopped asking long ago. Lou never made it to trial. 2 months after his confession, he was found in his cell. No struggle, no note, just gone. Some said it was guilt. Others said it was relief. I think it was both. His death didn't close anything. It just stopped one more voice from explaining how deep this went. Clyde Braxley's name became the public face of the case, the headline, the name people could attach their outrage to. But I'd seen enough to know there were others who never showed their faces. Men who signed invoices, approved renovations, made sure those rooms stayed off the books. We tried to follow the money, but too many companies had changed hands, too many records conveniently lost. Eventually, the Bureau took over and our local team was told to stand down. For a long while, I stayed away from the site. But as demolition wrapped up that fall, I drove out there one last time. The lot had been cleared, leveled flat except for the foundation lines etched faintly in the dirt. Someone had planted small wooden stakes where each chamber used to be 9 in a row. The grass was just starting to grow back around them, thin and fragile, but determined. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the field. You'd never know what had been underneath your feet if someone hadn't finally looked. I met Ethan's mother once, months after the case closed. She lived in a small apartment not far from where the old factory workers used to board. She didn't say much, grief that old doesn't use many words. She just asked me, was he alone? I told her no, because technically he hadn't been. There were others' children who'd shared the same walls, the same darkness. I don't know if that was comfort or just another kind of pain. Before I left, she handed me a photograph of Ethan at a birthday party, frosting on his face, eyes squinting in sunlight. She said, "They took everything, but they don't get that." I kept that picture on my desk for a while until the case files were sealed for storage. After the arrests, the city council passed a bill requiring that any demolition within the county involving structures older than 50 years include a full underground scan. It was the kind of small, practical change that bureaucrats make when they don't know what else to do. But still, I thought of it as something good, one more chance to make sure no other building hid a story like that. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It just hums quietly in the background, trying to prevent another silence. Even now, when I drive past that stretch of river, I still catch myself looking for the smokestack that isn't there anymore. The skyline looks cleaner without it, but emptier too. There's a space where the past used to stand, and it reminds me that we never really erase the things we've done, we just build over them. I think about the men who clocked in there every morning, the women who washed uniforms, the kids who waited at the gate for their fathers to come home. They all lived ordinary lives right beside something unthinkable. Maybe that's what unsettles me most, how easily darkness coexisted with routine. When the Bureau released their final report, it filled hundreds of pages and said almost nothing new. The official wording called it a pattern of exploitation enabled by institutional neglect. I remember reading that line over and over, how cold it felt, how far from the truth I'd seen in that room. A child's mattress, a candy wrapper, a scratched name on wood. Those weren't patterns. They were people. And they deserved to be spoken about as people. Sometimes late in the shift, I'd catch myself staring at the wall of old case photos in our office, faces of the missing, some solved, most not. And I'd realize that the thing keeping me going wasn't anger anymore. It was obligation. To remember. To make sure no one's story gets reduced to a footnote in an archive. That's what Ethan's case taught me. That memory is its own form of justice. Fragile, imperfect, but real. A year after we closed the file, a memorial went up where the factory once stood. Just a bronze plaque, simple, with 9 names carved in a single line. No speeches, no cameras. The families gathered quietly, set flowers down in the dirt, and left candles that flickered against the dusk. I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the light tremble in the wind. One of the mothers turned to me and said, "At least now they're above ground." I nodded. Sometimes that's the best we can do. Bring the lost back into the light, even if it's only through a name on a piece of metal. I still visit once a year. The grass has grown taller, the plaque already dulled by weather. But the air feels lighter there now. Not peaceful exactly, but honest. The kind of quiet that comes after someone finally tells the truth. When people ask me what stays with me from that case, I tell them it's not the horror or even the justice. It's that single line from Ethan's final recording. If someone sees this, I didn't run away. Those words sit in the back of my mind like a promise I haven't finished keeping. Because seeing means more than looking. It means paying attention, even when it hurts. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because somewhere right now, there's another place like that. Another silence waiting to be broken. And maybe one voice, yours, mine, anyone's, will be enough to make it finally speak.